I think that Lewis himself, he knows I'm backing you into a corner and I'm walling off all of your escape routes, and I'm going to get you back into the corner, and then I'm going to stop and I'm going to leave you an escape route. You can just reject God out of hand. You can just be unfaithful, but you're going to do it honestly. You're either going to say, no, God, I don't want it, and that I'm doing it my way. I'm choosing myself over you, or you can submit. You can humble yourself. You can relent. If we do relinquish our self-will, we find we enter into joy.
Welcome to the Crossway Podcast, a show where we sit down with authors each week for thoughtful interviews about the Bible, theology, church history, and the Christian life. I'm Matt Tully, and today I'm talking with Joe Rigney. Joe serves as Assistant Professor of Theology and Literature at Bethlehem College and Seminary. He's also a pastor at Cities Church and the author of a number of books, including Lewis on the Christian Life, Becoming Truly Human in the Presence of God with Crossway. Today, Joe and I discuss the legacy of one of the most beloved Christian thinkers and writers of all time, C.S. Lewis. We talk about how Lewis managed to so brilliantly capture the complexities of the human heart in so many of his writings, what he thought about The Lord of the Rings, written by his good friend JRR Tolkien, and what he might say to the American church if he were alive today. Let's get started. Joe, thank you so much for joining us on the Crossway Podcast today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I want to start with what might be an odd question, but of all the books that have come out over the last couple years, which one do you think C.S. Lewis would have been most interested and maybe even excited about if he were alive today?
Yeah, that's an interesting question to think about. Which books? You know, he read so much. When you read his letters to like his brother and to Arthur Greeves and some of his other friends, like all of the letters are oriented by books, what books each of them have been reading, what their opinions are of them. And he's such an eclectic kind of author. I think he'd be really interested in honestly in some of a lot of the ressourcement work going on, where modern groups are going back and finding untranslated works from the Middle Ages and from the Reformation era, and just kind of bringing a lot of these books into the modern. He at one point said that one of his favorite things was to kind of the devotional books that he was most interested in were heavy books of theology that he would kind of have to work through with a pipe in his mouth and a pencil in his hand. And so I think when you think about some of those type of works, I think that he could very well be interested in those. And then beyond that, he read very widely in like science fiction. So I think he'd be interested to see how that genre played out. He wrote science fiction, although it's a little bit of a different kind than what we typically think of. And so I suspect he would have kept up with that kind of genre, and to see how the fantasy genre developed. I'd be actually interested to hear his opinions. If you could actually get his the letters that he would write if he read like Harry Potter. What would be his assessment of the way that those stories, because, Rowling and others often talk about how the inspiration for what pushed them into, to write, young adult fantasy type stuff was, Lewis and Tolkien. Like those are the books that when you read the acknowledgments of a lot of these authors, it was the, Tolkien and Lewis fired their imagination as kids, and they said, we want to do that for other people. And so I'd actually be interested to read how he would evaluate some of the modern young adult fiction, and whether he would find it boring or whether he would think, wow, this is really good, meaningful, Narnia-like stuff, or not. So I think those are the questions I'd be interested in. As to specific books, he read so broadly that I think he'd find all kinds of things interesting. But the flip side of that is, his practice was to read, many more old books before reading modern books. And so, the most interesting book that he would read today would probably be something that was written, 500 years ago.
Yeah, you mentioned Tolkien, and as many of our listeners would know, they were good friends for a long time. Do we know anything about what Lewis thought about The Lord of the Rings? He wrote Narnia, but it's a very different type of fantasy story compared to The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
What did Lewis think about Tolkien's work and the whole mythology that he created?
Yeah, so Lewis is basically, I think, the first Lord of the Rings fanboy. So you actually, the reason that we have the Lord of the Rings, the reason those actually got published was, at least in part, because Lewis pushed so hard for Tolkien to get it done. And so he read The Hobbit. He read the others, and would push Tolkien to get them out, get them done. And Tolkien was such a meticulous world builder that it was never finished. And so so Lewis loved the Lord of the Rings, loved The Hobbit. In the space trilogy, he actually does this. I think it's kind of another subtle, "Hey, get it done, man," kind of moment, where at the end of, I think it's actually in That Hideous Strength, he says, if you want to, he mentions in there Numenor and the True West, which shows up in Lord of the Rings, and he says, if you want to find more about Numenor, you need to read the forthcoming books by my friend Professor Tolkien, and it's sort of like now I've said to everybody that you've got these books coming out. I just did your book launch for you, so get it done. Otherwise, you're going to get all kinds of letters from people who are going to be saying, "Hey, when's that book that Lewis said you were gonna put out? When's that coming?" So he was a big fan of the Lord of the Rings. Thought that these were the kind of books that he wanted to read. Now, the flip side of that is that Tolkien hated Narnia, just hated it. Thought it was a hodgepodge of mishmash. These characters don't make sense together. You've got this Snow Queen from Hans Christian Andersen. You got these 4 kids that are straight out of Edith Nesbit. If you read The Railway Children by Edith Nesbit, it's basically like there's the 4 kids. That's Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, but just with different names. And then you've got Father Christmas showing up, and then you got fauns from Greek mythology. And so Tolkien looked at that and said, it's not a coherent world. And Tolkien didn't like that. And so he kind of panned Narnia. I don't know that he ever did it publicly in print, but we know that he wasn't a fan. So Lewis loved what Tolkien did. Tolkien wasn't as much of a fan of what Lewis did.
So going back to what you said about Lewis mentioning Tolkien, it almost sounds like you're saying that there was this extended universe almost with Lewis's work kind of connecting over to the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's world. Is that right?
I think it was in the introduction to that book where he mentions if you want to find more about the True West, but there was a dovetailing like that Lewis was self-consciously kind of trying to say, hey, there is this, a little bit of a crossover. We're both interested in the same things. We both love in That Hideous Strength. It's the Arthur mythology and Merlin and all that. And so he was at least trying to say, if it's kind of like the, in Narnia, there's the wood between the worlds, where you go get the rings and you go into the wood between the worlds, and then you can get to Charn and you can get to Narnia and you can get to our world, and then there's all these other places you can go, but there's this connectedness of all of the worlds. Maybe think of it a little bit like that. Is that Lewis felt like, hey, I'm going to mention this stuff in my novel, and if you want to find out more, you can kind of go in the back door and then go into Tolkien's, and you can get the fuller story. And it's interesting too on that, the space trilogy was originally meant to be like a collaborative project. So Lewis was going to write a book about space travel, and it was kind of like a bet or something to that effect. Like, I'll write a book about space travel, Tolkien, then you write a book about time travel as a sequel. But Tolkien was just so slow that by the time Lewis's came out, Tolkien's not making progress. And so Lewis has to change the plan, and he ends up writing sequels for Out of the Silent Planet and finishing the trilogy himself, because Tolkien was so bogged down in the minutia of Middle-earth. And so that's one of the things about those two guys, which I think is encouraging at one level, is that they were so different in terms of the way that they went about building a world. Tolkien is so meticulous. Everybody has to have a genealogy. The languages have to be coherent. Whereas Lewis is more fluid. There's still a center, and I think one of the best books on that is Michael Ward's Planet Narnia, where he basically tries to show that Lewis did have an inner coherence to Narnia that even Tolkien didn't recognize. That Tolkien thought this is just a mishmash of Lewis's favorite things, and therefore it's not good story making. But in reality, there was this deep substructure in Narnia that was there, and that Lewis never told Tolkien, as far as we know, about it, but probably went to his grave chuckling about the heavenly conversation when he finally reveals, hey man, you know how you thought those books had no center, nothing tying them all together, they were just these random fairy tales? Guess what I did? And then there's this real unity to them. But they're so different as authors, and yet there's this friendship, this common core. But it's helpful, I think, for us as modern authors and modern readers to know there's not just one way to do this. There's not just one type of personality or one type of style or one type of genre. Like there's good writing can extend across multiple genres. and we can still be friends with each other even if we wouldn't write the same books.
As you think back over your own encounters with C.S. Lewis, which book of his have you reread the most times?
Yeah, so if I go over my whole life, it's got to be Narnia, just because I read those earliest and so have had more time. If I was to go back, say in the last 10 years, I would guess that Great Divorce and probably Till We Have Faces have been the most frequent. And part of that's because I teach those at Bethlehem College and Seminary. I teach a course on Lewis, and we read Great Divorce, Till We Have Faces, and the Space Trilogy, and Screwtape probably is another one that I've listened to that one multiple times. And so in recent years, those have been the ones, which are usually not the first ones that people think of. It's Mere Christianity, it's Narnia, Screwtape's on that list. But then there's sort of these, what I think of as like hidden gems. Great Divorce, I think, is a book that puzzles a lot of people because it's, what happens when you die, and does Lewis really think that people can get out of hell and go visit heaven? And he doesn't really. Like, that's not the point. It's a supposal. It's meant to be like, imagine this, and it's going to help you think more carefully about your own life. But I think it's a brilliant book that shows through caricatures and exaggerations the tendencies of our own hearts. And so I go back again and again to that one because there's just a lot of subtleties of how he develops these characters, as the main character, is journeying and meeting people who are dead, who are ghosts, but who still have a chance in the way the story's set up. They have a chance. They could still, if they wanted to, choose God, choose Christ, and be saved. And you get to see, stripped of all of the earthly excuses that we make, or the earthly facade that we put on, what the true motivations are underneath. And to see the rationalizations and what people choose, the lengths to which people will go to avoid God, and I find it just a really brilliant book in that respect. And it's actually, for your listeners, it's a great audiobook. The guy who does it, Julian Ryan Tutt, is the narrator. Does a great job of capturing the different voices and the personalities of the different characters, which really brings it to life. And Lewis was a good enough writer that that the different characters have different speech patterns and cadences and character to them. And that's a really rich book. The other one that I go back to again and again is Till We Have Faces, which Lewis said was his best book. In his mind, Till We Have Faces was his best book. It was his last book, or next to last. I think Letters to Malcolm came out after he died, but Till We Have Faces was his last book, his last novel, and in his estimation, it was his best. But in his letters, he says, but nobody else thinks that. All of the critics and nobody's buying it. It wasn't a bestseller the way that Screwtape was, but he felt like he had done something in that book that was really good. And I agree. When I teach it with my students, it's often one of the more influential, paradigm shifting type books that they read in that class, because of the way that Lewis unfolds this main character, Orwell, who's it's set in the ancient world, kind of before Christ, and in a pagan land, and it has to do with the gods and how what would how would a pre-Christian person relate to the gods, but really it's about human beings and the way that our natural loves, our love of family, our love of friends, our romantic love can derail us and need to die if we're to actually come to God truly. And it's just a really brilliant unfolding of the interior of this woman's mind, which is remarkable in itself, that Lewis as a man was able to write sort of this very authentic, what feels, at least to me, I've never been inside a woman's mind, but it feels to me very realistic, and the ladies in my class tend to agree about how she's thinking through things, how she's processing reality, the excuses and rationalizations she makes, and then this kind of cataclysmic moment where things change. I won't give away the ending, but anyway, it's a brilliant book, and Lewis thought it was really great. And yet, I talked to one Lewis lover friend of mine who said he just feels like that book's very gray. It doesn't sparkle the way Lewis's other books do, and so it doesn't resonate. But I think it's absolutely wonderful.
Something you've alluded to a couple times already is Lewis's penetrating insight into the human heart. He just seemed to get us, and he found words to express what's going on in our own hearts and our own minds in ways that I think sometimes we can't even put into words. Where do you think he got that ability to cut through the clutter of our hearts and reveal the truth of the issue?
Yeah, so according to him, he would say, where did I learn to do? It's in, I think, the preface to Screwtape. People asked after the book sold so well, I think it was in the second edition preface or something like that, where'd you learn to do this? And he said, I just know my own heart. So there was a personal self-awareness element to it. And one place he mentions the habit of imaginative honesty and sort of this, refusal to lie to yourself. And I think he had that. And so he recognized when he was making excuses, when he was trying to get around obligations and responsibilities. And so he was very dialed in, and yet he recognized that his own heart would argue with him about that. And so he grew very adept at recognizing those excuses and blame shiftings and justifications that we make for our sin and our weakness and our shirking of responsibility. And so he recognized it in his own heart, and then was able to go, I don't think I'm the only one. I think I see it in other people too, and was able to then articulate it in a very compelling and clear way. So I think that's one place, is just his own heart. I think the other place that he would point to is books. He said, when I read books, I'm able to see with other eyes. Like I become 1,000 men, and yet I remain myself. And so being able to see the world through other people's eyes, so being the voracious reader that he was, enabled him to be dialed into the human condition, the human heart, in such a way that was more penetrating than most. And so between books and his own honesty about himself, he had this, I like to say that Lewis, I think, is what all of us wish our conscience sounded like. And what I mean by that is he has a way of being absolutely relentless in his insistence on telling the truth and clarifying. So he's not going to let you off the hook. He's not, so when he's writing and he's trying to unfold, this is what you're thinking, and this is how you're trying to avoid God, and this is how you justified that. He's absolutely a bulldog, and he won't let you go. At the same time, he's not vicious. So he's not a vicious bulldog. He's relentless, but he's not mean. He's more of a surgeon who's going, there's a great scene in, I think it's Paralandra, where the main character Ransom is having this inner dialogue that turns out to be more like an outer dialogue with God about whether he's going to do the hard thing that he needs to do the next day. And he's making all these evasions and escapes. And at one point, he feels like he's standing in the presence of this voice, and the voice is just looking at him and saying, with a look, it's not actually a voice, but just, you're only wasting time. Like there's I'll wait. You can, spin yourself out, exhaust all of your excuses and let it all peter out. And then in the end, we'll still be right where we are, with the expectation that you do the hard thing, or not. You can choose to walk away. You can choose to abandon your post. You can choose to fail. And I'm giving you that dignity of choice, but you're not going to be able to evade it and make an excuse for it. You're going to see it straight on, and you're going to choose God or not. You're going to choose faithfulness or not. And I think that Lewis himself, in his writings, he resonates so much with us because he's like that. He knows, I know what I'm doing. I'm backing you into a corner as you read this essay, and I'm walling off all of your escape routes, and I'm going to get you back into the corner, and then I'm going to stop, and I'm going to leave you an escape route. You can just be a coward. You can just reject God out of hand. You can just be unfaithful, but you're going to do it honestly. You're either going to say, no, God, I don't want it, and that I'm doing it my way. I'm choosing myself over you. Or you can submit, you can humble yourself, you can relent, and you can enter into joy. I think that was a key part of it, is that if we do relinquish our self-will, we find we enter into joy. And so I think that's part of why he resonates so much, is that he knows how we work, and he's able to box us in, but not in a very not in a mean way or a cruel way or I'm going to get you, I know your heart, and I'm going to expose you, but more of a wise counselor who loves you type of way.
So one of the things that I think makes Lewis seemingly unique among a lot of Christian authors is the way that he appeals to such a wide spectrum of Christians from all kinds of denominations and backgrounds and theological persuasions. And included in that group would be theologically conservative Christians. evangelicals who read him and appreciate his works a lot, what's something about his theology or his approach to the Christian life that you think conservative evangelicals might be surprised to learn?
Whether they be surprised by it or not, I think maybe I know the things that bother them or bother me, um, and so one that may surprise people is that Lewis probably did believe in purgatory of some kind. I think that um, he was pretty clear that he didn't believe in the kind of medieval Catholic type of purgatory, like temporary hell sort of thing that you find in that the Reformation rightly rejected, but some notion of purification that continues after death, sanctification continues after death. It's not immediate. He seemed to probably believe something like that, and in my book on him, I try to explain what I think he's doing there. So that's a little bit odd for someone who's not Roman Catholic, but who is a lifelong Anglican. Um, so that's one surprising. I think things that bothered people tend to be his somewhat dismissive attitude toward the atonement, particularly how it works. So he believes in the atonement, but in terms of the explanation for the way in which it works, like Christ died to satisfy the wrath of God that was against us, and so some notion of propitiation or penal substitution. He's pretty. He kind of says, "Yeah, maybe that's true, but it's not very important," and he's somewhat dismissive of it in some of his writings, especially in his popular level stuff. Partly because I think he thinks it may be a stumbling block to people. It was a stumbling block to him. He didn't understand how it worked before he was a Christian, and so I think he's trying to say, you need to know that Jesus is for you and that he, died in your place. But what exactly that means, you don't have to necessarily figure out. And I think that's unfortunate. I don't think that that's a necessarily helpful approach. And in the book, I try to navigate how I would push on him, and because the reality is that one of the most brilliant depictions of penal substitution that I know of is Aslan dying for Edmund in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Like, Edmund is the traitor. Edmund's blood, he's the law, the moral law, the deep magic says he's got to die. He belongs to the witch now, and that's what the moral law says. And yet Aslan says, I've got a deeper magic, and I'm going to die in his place. And if I do that, death starts working backward, and everything comes right. And so, Aslan literally dies in place of, he takes the penalty of Edmund. And so that's a beautiful depiction of penal substitution, which we love as evangelicals. And so I think if I was having a conversation with Lewis, I would appeal to his own writings and say, hey, you've got all the categories here and you present it beautifully. Why the dismissive comments over here, and try to push there? I think the only other place, the place that I think I found him most helpful as in terms of bringing something that my own tradition tends to not emphasize. So I'm a, young, restless reform type guy. I'm a, Calvinist and all of that sort of stuff. Love the sovereignty of God, is the way that Lewis emphasizes the importance of human decision-making and choice. And that's something that a lot of Calvinists can be skittish about. We think if we emphasize human choice, then that means we're going to de-emphasize God's sovereignty. If we emphasize human free will, then we lose God's supremacy, something like that. So there's a kind of trade-off. And we say Arminians emphasize the human choice and we emphasize sovereignty. And I think Lewis is a great model of trying to, not lose either one, not let one part of the Bible mute the other parts of the Bible. And so in everything he wrote, I think this is the central thing that I argue in my book on him, is the central thing that he's always trying to do in everything he writes is bring us back down to the present choice, which is always, are you going to seek God, put God at the center, or are you going to put yourself or something else there? And that choice it has 1,000 different faces and everybody's different. But every day you're faced with that choice again and again and again and again. And his writing is designed to clarify the choice that you're making, and then to encourage and woo you to make the right one, to say that choosing God may be hard. Choosing obedience to God, faith in God may be really hard. It may cost you everything, but it is so worth it. And that's something that I've appreciated in my own. I think I've detected in my own pastoral ministry over the last 4 or 5 years since I began writing that book, and so I had to do a deep dive into Lewis. I've noticed that I accent that a lot more in my pastoral counseling and my preaching, than I probably would have when I was straight out of college or whatever, and it was still kind of on the Calvinist high and loved the sovereignty of God, but was a little skittish about pressing people for decision and choice. Like it's all on your shoulders. What you decide in this moment it matters, and it matters to God. Everything hangs on what you do with the gospel right now. And I think I've learned from Lewis, we have to do that, and that doesn't undermine or diminish the sovereignty of God, but is another element of this great mystery of the Christian life.
Kind of along the same lines, if Lewis were alive today and sitting in his office thinking about American Christianity, in what ways do you think he would speak prophetically to some of the cultural issues that we're wrestling through as Christians here in America?
If you read Abolition of Man, which is his little book on education, and if you read That Hideous Strength, which is the same content in fairy tale form, that's a package deal. He says it's a package deal. And there's a ton of social criticism and sort of what you're talking about with, speaking prophetically about the modern attempt to remake the world technologically, to use science and technology to overthrow and to remake what it means to be human. And he spotted a lot of trends and trajectories that really didn't become evident for another 20, 30, 40, 50 years, which is why you can read those books and feel like he's reading our newspaper. As he describes the villains in That Hideous Strength are called the NICE, which is a clever little, acronym, NICE, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. And, it's this cabal of different politicians and scientists who all want to remake the world and basically tell everybody what to do. And behind it all is demonic forces that are trying to destroy humanity. And then the counterpart to that is St. Anne's on the Hill, which is this little ragtag community of an injured scholar, a married couple, a professor and a housewife, a bear, and this Scottish skeptic who doesn't even believe in God but grows really good vegetables, And so that's this ragtag group, and they're the ones who have been gathered to oppose the entire might of this, scientific, military, industrial complex thing. But God's with them, and so they win. And I think that there's I've actually seen a few essays here and there over the years online about basically doing, thinking about culture war in those terms, using Jake Meador at Mere Orthodoxy has written, I think, some on this at various times about using the St. Anne's on the Hill model of cultural engagement, of we're going to build our own little, we're going to be faithful where we're planted and try to be faithful as husbands and wives and faithful churches, very unassuming. And then God is going to give us the deliverance against the great might of the states and societal, cultural, media power. And I think that there's something to that. I think that Lewis would probably continue to strike that note in the present day. And I think he would be the other, maybe one other issue that he'd, I think, be very dialed into is the manhood, womanhood stuff. I think he'd recognize that the attempt by modern man to move beyond the natural boundaries of our humanity is a disaster and destructive and harmful to people, and would want to help people recognize the goodness of manhood and womanhood, the goodness of that men and women are different, that they're both valuable, that they're both essential for God's purposes in the world. And so I think he would very much, and I suspect he'd be doing it in surprising ways, not maybe the typical, he would come at it sideways, because that's what he tended to do. He'd write fiction about it. Maybe less so than I'm going to write, would he sign the Danvers Statement or the Nashville Statement or anything like this? And I don't know. I doubt it, actually. But would he write fiction that would try to present the beauty and glory of masculinity and femininity? Oh yeah, he did that, right? He was doing it in his day. He would have continued to do it. And I think that's where he actually is he's very potent as a teacher, is in not just saying this is what's true, but it's true and it's good and it's beautiful. And he draws you into this great dance that he portrays in the Space Trilogy and in Narnia and other places.
If you had 1 hour to sit down with Lewis today for coffee at a Starbucks, and you could talk about one topic, what would you want to talk to him about?
Yeah, I should preface this question by saying I think many people mistakenly think that they would really enjoy an hour with C.S. Lewis. And I say mistakenly because I think they hear his authorial voice, and he's got a very kind of comforting, I don't know if grandfatherly is probably the right word, but there's a rapport. You feel like, oh, we'd be friends. I love listening to him talk, and I would like to talk with him. My impression from the biographies that I read is that he would have. I would much rather write him letters about stuff. I think that would be a much more fruitful. We'd both get a lot more out of it. I suspect that in person it would be very awkward. And so I think with people that he was friends with, that he developed that relationship with, they had great debates, and the Inklings and Tolkien and Charles Williams and Orrin Barfield and all of that kind of stuff. If you could get to that level with him, man, the topics are endless of what you could dive into. But as just like, hey, I'm just this random guy, I suspect it would be awkward. And some of that would be, I'm awkward probably too, not just him. So it would be mutually awkward. And I'm a fan, so that's weird too. But if I was going to correspond with him, I think two topics that would immediately jump out to me was, one, the manhood womanhood thing. I'd just love to hear him talk more about that. He's so suggestive and insightful, I think, in the way he depicts it. And I would just love to probe that a little bit, ask questions about, hey, what did you mean by this in Paralandra? Or what, when you showed this in Let Hideous Strength, was this what you were going for? So I think that would be an interesting line of inquiry. And then the other would be actually to hear him talk more about prayer. And the reason for that is, one of his last books is Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. And I just find it a very helpful little book on different types of prayer, the challenges of prayer. And it's a question that he wrestled with his whole life. He wrote number of essays about, if God's sovereign, why pray type stuff, and recognized that prayer is hard, and yet that prayer is really important. It's the place where we open ourselves up and say, God, I know God's always there. He's always accessible. He's always with you. He's present all throughout his creation. So you can't escape him, but you can ignore him. And prayer is the place when you stop ignoring him and actually engage with him as a person. And God then engages with you as a person. And so Lewis thought this is like the meeting place of creator and creature in prayer. And I just want to hear him talk more about that and hear about maybe a little bit more of the personal side, which I think we get in his letters some, and we get in that book. But I'd want him to open up a little bit more about that. I think the other thing that I'd be interested in doing, this would actually be my way in. Okay, if I was gonna have the conversation with him, I would actually want him to read either Live Like a Narnian or Lewis on the Christian Life, and I'd want to, and then I'd want to argue about it. Did I get you right? Where did I get you wrong? Is that what you meant? Is that, like, in other words, I think the best way into actually a fruitful conversation with him would be to make it less personal at the front end and more about ideas, more about objective content that we can like discuss and kind of lose ourselves in that aspect. Like, we're not thinking about each other as how's your heart, man? That kind of level, but more about, is this the truth about this issue? Did you get that right? Were you right about the atonement? Or would you say that God is sovereign in this way? Like, and to actually get into the debate, I think that would probably develop a friendship more quickly with a man like him than anything else.
Joe, thanks for joining us on the Crossway Podcast today and for sharing a little bit about your own journey with C.S. Lewis.
Well, it's my pleasure. I love talking about Lewis and love exploring these topics.
That was Joe Rigney on the legacy of C.S. Lewis. For more, be sure to check out his book with Crossway, Lewis on the Christian Life, Becoming Truly Human in the Presence of God, available online or at your local Christian bookstore. For more interviews like this, subscribe to the Crossway Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review, which helps us spread the word about the show. Crossway is a not-for-profit Christian ministry that exists solely for the purpose of proclaiming the truth of God's Word through publishing gospel-centered content. Visit us today at crossway.org.